Hello, everybody. Nice to see your names from around the country. Welcome to this Life Course Centre seminar. I'm chairing the seminar today. I was keen to do it given the topic aligns very closely with my own research interests, and it's also our last seminar for the year, so I'm going to chair today's presentation. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. I pay our respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And we recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Leonora Risse. Leonora is an associate investigator in the Life Course Centre, and she's been involved in a number of our activities over recent years. She's going to be talking about women's work and how much it's undervalued in the economy, which is a really important and interesting topic. Leonora is an economist by training. She did her PhD here at UQ, and I've known Leonora for many years. She's been a senior lecturer in economics at RMIT. She's a research fellow with the Women's Leadership Institute in Australia, and an expert panel member on gender pay equity with the Fair Work Commission. So she's had a lot of applied engagement roles in this space, as well as undertaking academic research. She's in the process of leaving RMIT and moving to University of Canberra, and she'll commence there as an associate professor in gender economics early in the new year. And we'll be very pleased to keep in touch with her as she starts on that new role at UC. So thank you very much, Leonora. Thank you very much for being here, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Janine, for the very warm and generous welcome. And thank you to the Life Course Centre for hosting this seminar and the invitation to share this research with you all. And thank you to everyone for tuning in and for your interest in this topic. I hope that the title itself is self-explanatory for the research question that we're going to dive into today. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands. For me today, that's the Yugambeh people, and I acknowledge I'm joining you from Bungalang country. So the issue of the undervaluation of work that's traditionally associated with women is a broad question, and it's informed by various streams or various layers of research and problems and issues that we can identify. So what I've suggested as our starting point is to think about the inequities, the injustices, the gender gaps that we observe in the economy, and to map out some research questions that this data analysis attempts to provide some answers for. So as Janine has mentioned, my background is in economics. So I'm looking at this from the perspective of the gender gaps in economic outcomes and experiences and why they persist. And we know that there are many, many researchers attempting to tackle this question. And this research comes to it from the perspective of investigating the extent to which this ongoing and historical undervaluation of work that's traditionally done by women can help to explain why we still see these persistent gender gaps in pay and other economic outcomes. And of course, once we're talking about work that's assigned to women under societal norms, we're also not just talking about paid work, but unpaid work and care. And for many people, you might not even be aware that when we talk about the economy, when you hear about measurements of GDP, gross domestic product, when you hear about measurements of employment and labour force participation, conventional economic approaches don't include unpaid work and care. So when you hear about women's labour force participation, that's only if women are being paid to do that job. When we talk about the decline in GDP, such as during the pandemic, where the economy was declared to be in a recession, that was not counting the unpaid productive activity that households were engaging in. So partly what we look at is the extent to which that invisibility of work that's associated with women sends a message or conveys an ideology that this work is of lower status and therefore of less worth in the economy. And we're going to explore some of the ways that the economic frameworks contribute to that distinction. What's counted, what's visible, what's elevated in the economy, as opposed to what's taken for granted, what's made to be invisible or neglected and considered as less important. Looking at unpaid work and care is also incredibly important for thinking about how are we going to go about pursuing gender equality across the economy. And more within the research, it's becoming evident that we have to draw the connection between gender equality initiatives in the paid workforce and organizational space and in the unpaid space. It seems quite unrealistic to assume or to expect that we can achieve gender balance in paid work if we're not also thinking about achieving gender balance in unpaid work and care. And an observation is that so much of our policy focuses on gender balance in the paid workforce space, and less so, it's relatively less attention on the initiatives and the incentives and the rewards that are in place to bring about a greater gender inclusivity and balance in the unpaid work and care space. On the upside, you might also share the observation that amongst policy at the moment, there is an increasing focus on care and well-being, for example, the well-being approach to the budget. So that's positive. There's also been changes in IR legislation in Australia that necessitates a greater focus on gender equity. So for us as researchers and practitioners, it's really important to ask what gender data and analysis is needed to help inform these policy directions. And then moving from sort of the workforce or the household and micro level space, thinking about the big economy and productivity and macro dimensions, we hear, if you've been tuning into what the economists are talking about, this productivity slowdown that's occurred and been observed over time, at the same time that services in the care sector have expanded in their role in the economy. So it's very conceivable that the way that, because we have not been fully valuing the productive output of the care services and the care sector, that is in part contributing to this observed slowdown in measured productivity, because we're not fully recognizing or appreciating the output and therefore the productivity of the care sector. So it necessitates that we accurately measure the productive value of care services and think of it as more than just consumption, but an investment in productive activity, if we are to actually have accurate measures of our productivity across the whole economy. So there's sort of the suite of reasons and motivational areas that sort of sit behind this research, and that I attempt to provide some answers to. So I'm going to break this up into sort of two streams of analysis. The first is thinking about women's work in the paid workforce, or work that is traditionally associated with women through gender norms, through societal norms, and the assertion that women's work is undervalued, and that's what is at least partially contributing to this ongoing gender pay gap. So I use workforce data to look at the statistical link between the gender composition of each occupation and industry and the hourly pay rate, while also controlling for a set of other factors that can otherwise determine pay. So what we're looking for now is not the gender of the individual, but the gender composition, is it a female concentrated space? Is it a male concentrated space? Or is it a gender balanced space? And to what extent is that patterned to the prevailing pay rate in that sector? And then complementing that, I also look at the unpaid care and workspace, which is where women's contribution, or this unpaid works, is not even counted in our economic statistics. So it gives rise to this assertion that women's contribution is being ignored. And so we use time use survey data to measure the hours and minutes that households are allocating to unpaid work and care, what we can call unpaid productive activity. It's measured by way of volume, hours and minutes. And what we do is we assign an equivalent labour market value to that activity. So, for example, if we look at time spent looking after children, we take a measurement of what childcare workers are paid and allocate that labour market value to that activity. Now, I know what you're thinking, that childcare workers are not paid enough as they should be in the paid workforce. So what we then do is we take those estimations of the extent to which female concentrated jobs are undervalued rather relative to other jobs, and we correct and upwardly adjust the value that we're assigning to unpaid productive activity as well, to try to correct for that undervaluation. So in that respect, this analysis is actually bringing together those two domains of paid work as well as unpaid work, and using the parameters and the estimations to help nuance and refine this attempt to measure that value. So on the screen there, I've just sort of mapped out some of the steps of the methodology. What this analysis does, it makes use of very recently released data. So we only get the census data every 5 years, of course, and that allows us to unpack this information at a granular level with a population-wide data set. I also make use of the Hilda data set, which is excellent for analysing wage data. So that's informs our paid work analysis. And then on the right-hand side, I use the newly collected ABS time use survey data. For those of you who aren't aware, Australia went through a spell of not running the time use survey data for quite a period of time. It was 2006? I think it was the last time it was run. So we went through this period of not worrying about this data, and it wasn't officially collected. And so a lot of effort went towards re-establishing those data collection processes in recognition that this activity was important for official statistics. And then, as I mentioned, we identify the activities that are being undertaken by the household that have productive value, even if they're not paid, and we assign a proxy occupation to that activity, sum all of that up, and work out what would be the equivalent if you were to have a labour market wage attached to that. And then we analyse men and women's respective shares. So as I mentioned before, this analysis tries to bring together those two domains of unpaid and paid work. And effectively in the paper, what underpins it all is the prevalence of these gender norms that shape these gender pattern differences in pay and in the nature of the activities that men and women are undertaking. And we look at the interaction effects and how, for example, patterns in unpaid work spill over into these gender relativities in the paid workforce. So it is an attempt to bring together the common elements, the common forces that are giving rise to these patterns across both spaces. And also to recognise that gender patterns at home that are prescribed by social norms will shape and determine people's capacity to engage in the paid workforce, of course. Arising out of that analysis, what I then do is sum up basically what is women's total contribution to the economy if we adjust for this undervaluation of female concentrated sectors. So taking the estimates and recalibrating what is women's contribution to the economy. And likewise, if we were to include unpaid work and care, what would women's contribution to the economy actually be? Currently, the current conventions would be based solely on paid work at the prevailing labour market pay rate. So this analysis says, okay, if we include unpaid work and care, and if we adjust for the pay rate that's associated with industries and occupations simply by being a female concentrated sector, what exactly would be women's overall aggregate contribution to the economy? And it's a lot higher than current conventions would suggest. When we talk about gender norms, I'm going to also bring into this discussion, this is more than simply the male breadwinner, female caregiver model of the household that shapes individuals and couples and family dynamics or household dynamics. When we talk about gender norms, we're also talking about the frameworks, the systems that have been designed to measure the economy and to effectively define value in the economy. So we're talking about the systems of national accounts, the conventions, the rules that govern what gets counted, what doesn't get counted, and what does that signify about what is worthy and what isn't worthy. And now, for those of you who are on the line who have heard of Marilyn Waring's work, that's wonderful. If you haven't and you're interested in the domain of unpaid work and the way that gender dynamics have played out in economics, I highly recommend the amazing work of Marilyn Waring. Marilyn's work goes back many, many decades. She was one of the first economists to highlight the shortcomings of GDP long before the male economist cottoned onto it and were commissioned to do work in this space. She was exploring it as a PhD student. So if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend getting hold of Marilyn Waring's books. There are also some great online talks, TED Talk presentations. Her point is that the way that these economic structures have been designed are done so in a way that elevates the productive activities that are associated with masculinity in society. So they elevate the activities that society assigns to men, and they dismiss or devalue or overlook or ignore the activities that societal norms ascribe to women. And that gives rise to these systems of measurement that really are reflections of the male experience and do not encompass or neglect or overlook the female experience. I want to pause and acknowledge at this point that these concepts and this discussion up to this point has been limited to binary classifications of gender. And that's very much driven by the way the data and existing research has conducted itself. And that points to the need to also expand beyond, in future work, to expand beyond not just talking about male and female, but to raise awareness of how gender norms are limiting to men, to women, to people who identify across all of the gender spectrum. So I want to acknowledge that, and it's not an intentional exclusion. This is just where the research is sort of, or the discussion historically has sort of concentrated. The takeaway here, though, is that the existence of these societal norms and gender orders are done so in a way that elevates the male experience and can be to the exclusion of the female experience, and can also be to the dismissal of the experiences of people who identify beyond that binary experience as well. So when we're talking about the UN systems of national accounts, what exactly are we talking about? So here's an excerpt which spells out really where this is coming from in terms of what's counted and what isn't. And so it talks in terms of this boundary of production. What is included within the boundary gets counted as GDP, gets counted as employment, and household production or household consumption for own household production for own consumption is outside of that boundary. And it's interesting that I've read through this document. It's like it's quite a volume. It's about 700 pages, but there are some really insightful revelations in there as to why household production was excluded. And this statement, for example, alludes to the fact that if you were to count household activity, then by definition, everyone would be employed. And that would be problematic because it meant we wouldn't have meaningful employment statistics. And that word meaningful, I think, is very significant because it suggests that production and activity within the household is not meaningful. So there's a lot of interesting nuance in these systems of national accounts, which kind of signal what is valued and what isn't. Okay, so that's sort of the backdrop. That's the space where we're operating in. Here's some of the data. So this is looking first at unpaid work and care. So this is the raw data from the ABS time use survey data. You can see the comparison of men to women. So men undertake on average more hours than women in terms of paid work, but women collectively on average are doing more in terms of domestic work, childcare, caring for adults, and volunteer work. So what we then do is we take each of those activities that are listed in the time use survey data, and we have the average amount of time that men and women are spending on those activities, and we identify a proxy occupation from the ANSCO code. We then work out what would be the prevailing hourly income for that occupation, and we assign that to the hours that households are undertaking. So this is not in terms of hours anymore. This is in terms of equivalent labour market value. So you can see that on average, this is what men's time allocation amounts to in terms of the labour market equivalent. And this is the unpaid work and care. So you can see women are doing more than men in terms of the equivalent labour market value of that unpaid work and care. And this is based on a per week estimation. So it's something that people can kind of relate to. So then we look at those shares. We take those numbers and we aggregate it up to shares. So this first column here is just in terms of hours, just in terms of time. So we look at all paid work in the economy. Men are doing proportionally more than women. Unpaid work, in terms of hours, women are doing more than men. We add it together, we're getting close to 50-50 in terms of total time. On the right-hand side, this now assigns the labour market value. So paid work is the average pay rate. So if we were just looking at paid work, it would suggest that men are contributing, or men make up 63% of that activity, and women are contributing to 37% of that total activity in the economy. If we were to look at unpaid work, unpaid productive activity, women are doing the bulk, almost 2/3. When we add the two together, we're now getting closer to 50-50. So the comparison, the two numbers to compare here is if we just look at paid work, it would suggest women's labour contribution is around about 37% to the economy. Once we add in unpaid work and put a value on it, we're now at 47%, so an increase of 10 percentage points. So women's actual contribution is being understated, right, when we just look at paid work. So here that is in words. Another way to express that down the bottom here, when we cut the data up, is just over half, 55% of women's productive contribution to the economy is in the form of unpaid work, compared to just under 1/3 of men's. Inversely, you could say women are being remunerated for 45% of their productive contribution to the economy, while men are being remunerated for 69% of theirs. So there's a lot of unpaid, unrecognised, non-remunerated productive activity that women are carrying out. So this is before we adjust for the fact that some of those proxy occupations are attached to quite low incomes to begin with. So now this takes us into the space of the paid workforce. And this is where we're interested in seeing if the extent to which an occupation or an industry is female concentrated, is that pattern to a lower pay rate. And indeed, if an industry or a sector is male concentrated, to what extent is that pattern to a higher pay rate? So this is the census data. So here, this was extracting the census data for every occupation that was available at the finest level of disaggregation. So just to navigate this graph, from left to right is the female share of the occupation. So on the left-hand side are the male concentrated jobs. On the right-hand side of the graph are the female concentrated jobs, like childcare, aged care. And then vertically from bottom to top is the average hourly income. I haven't used dollar terms. I've just used relativities because we know from year to year and inflation can throw things out. So just in terms of relativities, where you've got the average for the economy, for the workforce at 100%. So that line down the middle is your average. Anything above that 100% line means a higher than average, and conversely below. The size of the bubble tells you the number of people employed in that occupation. So the bigger the bubble, the larger the number of size of that occupation. So on the next slide, I'm going to put in some labels so you can see what some of these occupations are, and already you might be able to guess what some of them are. But a big takeaway here is to look at the emptiness in the top right-hand corner. So this is where you would have a convergence of female concentrated jobs receiving higher than average pay. Notice how there are very, very few. In fact, there's no dots up here. If you are looking for a high income job, it's over here in the male concentrated sector or gender balance. This is your GPs up here. You'll also notice that you've got some very large groupings, some quite clustered occupations, which suggests that there's little room for a gradient, a wage gradient and career trajectory in some of these female concentrated jobs. And also there are a large number of low paid male concentrated jobs as well. So this is not to neglect the fact that there are still many workers in this space as well. So here are some labels to add a bit more concrete examples to that. So it's probably no surprise, but we're talking about childcare workers, aged care, disabled carers being in the same vicinity as sales assistants, checkout operators, and general clerks, primary school teachers up here. Up here are chief executive, GPs, software engineers. Okay, so I'll move to the next one, which is not by occupation, but by industry, again by census data, so same sort of pattern. Again, notice the absence of points up here in the top right corner and the clustering of these female concentrated industries of employment. So this is more about location of work or service provided, product provided. So what the analysis attempts to do is look at what is the statistical link between these two dimensions if we control for all the other factors that we can possibly control for in our data that can otherwise determine wages. So we run a linear regression and we put in variables to represent or to measure the gender composition of the occupation and the industry. And this is in alignment with the way that WGEA defines what's male concentrated. More than 60% of employment is men, vice versa for female, or you have these gender balance, which are the reference point. So there's the methodology behind that. So here are the findings. It's generated by the model. So controlling for all other factors, if it's a female concentrated occupation, 3.7% lower wage. If it's a male concentrated occupation or industry, it's a 6.4% or 3.1% higher wage rate, respectively. What I want to also point out is that in the model, I include various other variables that can potentially explain gender pay gaps and are often given as the reasons. And one is, well, women's work is less dangerous, right? So men are doing more hazardous, more risky work, like construction, mining. So I use data from Safe Work Australia that looks at workplace fatalities and workplace injuries by occupation, by industry. I put that into the model. It does not affect the results. The reason why is that there are quite a number of female concentrated sectors that are also subject to higher injury rates and workplace assaults, such as nursing, frontline customer service. It's not just about mining and construction. There's also female concentrated jobs, which also have fatality or injury rates, I should say, that are on par with some of the male concentrated ones. And equally, I put in a measurement of workplace flexibility. Sometimes it's asserted that women accept lower wage jobs, or these sectors are lower paid because we're factoring in more workplace flexibility. Again, the findings are unchanged. And that can also be explained by the fact that you have jobs like a lot of CEOs and managers, they have a lot of workplace flexibility that they're not trading off for their high wage. So those explanations, those factors can't explain away these gender outcomes. I think for time, I might have to skip over some of the other results, but in the gender pay gap analysis, you also can identify where there are other variables that are explaining differences in hourly pay and where gender gaps are emerging. And I think a consistent one is that often there's a gender patterned, a gender difference in the reward that's attached to certain variables. So, for example, women do have higher levels of education and cognitive skills, which contributes to narrowing the gender pay gap. But then for a given qualification, men experience a higher return. So you've still got these gender disparities. Collective bargaining, workplace size also plays a role. Again, higher returns to men. In case anyone's interested, this is sort of the nature of the results. It's measured by way of marginal effects. What I also extract from the research is not just the variation that's explained by the gender composition of the sector, but also by the gender of the worker. So that's included in the analysis. And so you find that controlling for everything else, being female is associated with a 6% lower wage rate. So I also put that into the adjustments later on to figure out what exactly is women's overall labour market contribution. In the paper, we also map out where these particular factors sit relative to all the other factors. So you can see the relative explanatory size of gender composition in industry, skills, age, wage setting mechanisms are also very important, but you can see these factors also do play a significant role. Okay. So just to convert this into what do we do with this information. So on the screen, I apologize, there's sort of a lot going on, but where this takes us is on the screen, we've got this breakdown of gender shares in total labour activity, or the value of that activity. And so this goes back to that earlier slide we had when we said we're just looking at paid work. Women, we can calculate contributing around 37% of total labour market income in the economy. Men are contributing 63%. And so progressively, line by line on this graph, what we do is we make the adjustments that are informed by the model that account for adding in unpaid work and then adjusting for this undervaluation of female concentrated sectors and the overvaluation of male concentrated sectors. So line by line, those percentages start to shift. And by the time you factor in adjusting for unpaid work, adjusting for the undervaluation, female concentrated, overvaluation of male concentrated, and adjusting for this female wage penalty, we're getting pretty close to 50-50. So this top line is what's reported by official economic statistics. This bottom line is once you account for these gender patterns. I think the more that I analyze this and we look at the numbers, and many of us sitting in this conversation today, in this seminar today, can think about the implications and the repercussions of these gender disparities. It has implications for women's access to finance, for the division of assets between households when there's a dissolution of marriage or separation. It has implications for women's retirement security, their economic independence across their lifetime. The more I work on this, the more I think I end up going deeper to the point that it becomes clear that this is not just about day-to-day living and economic experiences. This is about how this gender gap in pay is reflective of the gender gap in status, that the activity, the economic contributions that women are doing is afforded lesser status in the economy than that of men's. And so if we can interpret it as something deeper than just that monetary transaction, which of course is important for livelihoods, but it's about how the system that governs or gives rises to that monetary outcome or that financial outcome is informed by some distinction in what is valued as higher status, what is lower status. And then if we look at the invisibility of unpaid work and care and the fact it's not counted in our conventional measurements, it also prompts us to think about what do we really mean when we use the words economic inclusion or economic participation. It's really clear from the time you survey data that on average, women are actively contributing to the economy. They're doing productive activity that matters for the fabric of our society and matters for the functioning of our economy. They're not included in the numbers. So it's not the women themselves who aren't included, who aren't actively participating. It's that they're not being counted in the numbers, they're not being recognized. So when we talk about labor force participation, it's talking about activity for which there is a product or service that's being bought and sold in the market. It's not necessarily fully embracing of what has economic value. So I would reword that to say the gender gap in workforce participation is actually a gender gap in recognition of activity. So where there's a time and place to do so, I would encourage you to think about how the economic language we use is also loaded with some of those assumptions and biases. I think lastly, some of the other policy implications, there are quite clear implications for how this could help to inform work on gender pay equity, for painting a picture of the full productive activity of the economy. I've made use of some excellent work by Lynn Craig and Brendan Churchill that was studying analysing the activity of households during the recession, during the pandemic, and the economy was declared in recession, as in there was a slowdown, but there were households that were actually bursting at the seams in terms of their productive activity. So it was sort of in contrast to what the official statistics were measuring. And as I said before, we've got to make sure that we're valuing care services correctly. Otherwise, what looks like a productivity slowdown could actually just be a mismeasurement issue. If we're not measuring the care services sector accurately, then we're not investing in it as required as well. So a takeaway point, I think, is to acknowledge, firstly, the limitations of how gender is defined here, and that I have talked in terms of women's work, but effectively that's shorthand for saying this is about work that's assigned to people and cohorts in society who have lesser power, status, and worth. And we think about the way that low-skilled or unskilled migrants have been brought into the economic system to undertake some of this work as well. What I also haven't covered off on in my discussion today is doing justice to an intersectional gender lens, which is to acknowledge different dimensions of experience beyond gender. But the more that I work on the intersectional dimension, this leads me to really the essence of what Crenshaw's work on intersectionality is about, which is about questioning decision-making structures. So who decided on the system? Who was the system designed for? Effectively, that's the question that an intersectional gender lens prompts us to ask. So I'll just finish off on this slide, which is saying who decided on the system, who was the system designed for. We come back to this system of national accounts, which governs this architecture for how our economy is defined and operates. Who decided on the system? Well, the national accountants, it makes it clear, they're the ones who decided. And who was it designed for? And here it reveals some of their thinking behind it. They deem that it's extremely difficult to estimate the value of household activity, that it doesn't have economic meaning, that it would impede their potential or their capacity to look at policy and analyze markets, the definition of markets being so limited. So I think when we're in this space of trying to expand and broaden our knowledge, we also have to interrogate some of these fundamental assumptions that underpin these national systems. The good news is that it looks like that this system of national accounts, that reviews are being conducted over the next couple of years to interrogate some of these assumptions and to perhaps look for more inclusive and meaningful definitions and practices as well. So that's some good news to potentially keep an eye on. Thank you very much.
Jenny Courtney, I can see, has a question.
Yeah,
Jenny.
I couldn't figure out how to do a virtual one, so I did a real hand.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation and the data. I'm from Human Ability. We're a relatively new organisation, a Jobs and Skills Council set up by the federal government, and we look after the care and support industries. So looking at workforce issues, but also we steward the VET qualifications across early childhood, aged care, health and human services, and sport and rec. So really, really important information for us. We've recently held some forums of employers and peaks and unions unpacking some of the big issues, and it's, nothing new for you. But one of the questions and thoughts I had that linked to some of the work that we were doing at our forums was around any generational differences that you might be seeing with Generation Z coming through. They're predominantly our vet sector students coming in. Is it, carrying through these gender imbalances, or is there anything else that might be in that data for that new bunch of workforce participants?
Thank you very much, Jenny, for joining us today and for sharing your work and for the work that you do. A really, really important question about intergenerational change, because ideally, that's a window of hope for progress over time, right? But is it guaranteed or is it evident? Some of the work, some of my observations would be if we look at the space of encouraging more men to participate in caregiving, say paid parental leave, I think the conversations and the policy practices are widening to understand that there needs to be a more legitimate role for fathers in the design of policy like paid parental leave. And I would hope, I sense that is partially a generational dynamic as well, but it also depends on this younger cohort of fathers and partners feeling reassured by the organizational culture that they're working in, that their aspiration to be a more involved parent will be respected and supported and not penalized. So I think there could potentially be more of a shift in aspirations, but it's not necessarily going to be realized if the organizational and social culture doesn't also progress at the same time to enable those aspirations to be realized. One sort of cautionary approach I would also add is when looking at the gender attitude data, like in Hilda, they ask a set of questions regarding gender roles in society. Statements like men are better at being political leaders, or men are better suited to being the breadwinner and women should stay at home. So the standard set of questions. And sometimes we do see in the younger age groups sort of more progressive, less traditional attitudes. But then when you map the same individual over time, you can sometimes see a regression back to more traditional attitudes by the individual at a personal level, which could be a reflection of them feeling that societal norms aren't making it very easy to sustain these more progressive attitudes. So generational snapshots also have to be tracked by the individual as well, not just assume that that person's attitude while they're young will actually persist over time. So I think it's hopeful, but we still need to keep monitoring and realize it's a convergence of factors.
Thanks, Leonora. That was a really fantastic overview and really comprehensive work. Very, very detailed and interesting. I'm really struck by your final slide about the valuing of women's work, in quotes, or the value of work of low status individuals. And it seems like the measurement issue which you kind of point to is pernicious in that it can, if you measure it incorrectly, it can have flow-on effects to all the ways that you that try to assess this work. And so I'm really curious, just as I was thinking about that, thinking about the impact that COVID and the lockdowns had on our view of the different roles in society. So when COVID lockdown occurred, some occupations got special permission to go to work because they were considered necessary workers, right? And some of those occupations were low status. A lot of them were low status work that's not paid a lot. And so I'm wondering if did COVID and that kind of government response and the response in there throughout our culture and society, I guess, do you think that changed our view of the value of that work? Because I agree that work is not valued financially or economically, but I do think there's more recognition now that it is valuable work. And the same with a lot of female-dominated work, like teaching and nurses, obviously. Same point. Do you see anything, any change due to COVID?
Oh, thank you, Richard, for your reflections there. Very thoughtful and timely. I do think there were quite a lot of people who shared that sense of there's the potential here for a re-evaluation and a recognition of the very real importance of these jobs, these essential jobs. Absolutely, I agree that COVID presented a very vivid example, particularly when people had to sort of pseudo step into those jobs and be a school teacher effectively to their child at home. I think the distinction is that essential doesn't necessarily equate to status in practice. So absolutely essential for the functioning of society, and so the fabric and functioning would have unthreaded had some of these essential workers not been able to continue. But then the way that society and the economy operates doesn't necessarily mean that equates to status. And I think with economic status is also an element of decision-making or authority or control and power. So being an essential worker still means that your task is essential, but your capacity to control resources or make executive decisions or authorize others is not part of that task description. So it doesn't necessarily equate to the way that society, the economy rewards some of these what are considered more executive decision-making oriented skills that kind of equate to status. So I think there was an opportunity that I hope we don't lose. I hope the momentum stays really strong. Partially, it is a matter of where is the large-scale critical mass institutional voice for the workers who you've described, so they can have more of a bargaining power or more of a voice in decision-making regarding their wage and working conditions. And
how do you get collective action for parents? What happens when parents go on strike? Like, mothers go on strike.
Yeah, I think Iceland, the women did that again recently, a few weeks ago, to make the point really known. That's right. I think they're the ingredients that are still not guaranteed or aren't there without some sort of concerted effort. But thanks for your question. I think there's still possibility and still potential to still work off that momentum and that realization. Particularly, sorry, just to say too, there are still data sets, there's still analysis being carried out into this grand experiment to really solidify and add more concrete backing to prove the value of these workers' activities as well. So we're still harnessing that.
There's two questions in the chat, but I want to go to Guion, who's here online with a hand up. I'll go to you first, Guion.
Thanks, Leonora. That was a great talk. And I guess I was one of these people that hoped that COVID did sort of mean there would be some turnaround in the valuing of some of the jobs that are sort of female dominated. I guess you mentioned in your talk sort of the sharing of paid and unpaid work to sort of a greater extent. And I guess that would be a potential, solution for the financial sort of disadvantage that women are facing at the moment by sort of taking the lion's share of the lesser valued productive activities in life. Do you see other ways that you could sort of overcome that financial disadvantage? So in the case where people sort of don't actually want to do that sharing of care and paid work, can you see other solutions to sort of, bridge that gap between sort of, the value of a task and then how much is being paid for a task?
Good question. Are you thinking about the unpaid work or the low paid work in the paid economy?
Both, I think, because I think they sort of do work together. I think unpaid work is probably, I don't know, you might know from your calculations which of the two is sort of the greater share of the difference. I would think the unpaid work, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one. I feel like they're very fluidly connected, and until we even recognize unpaid work in official statistics, it's always invisible. And then the jobs that are a mirror or a reflection or kind of an extension of unpaid domestic work and care that are in the paid economy will continue to be lesser valued because it's perceived as an extension from that unpaid invisible space, right? And so until we recognize and make visible that work, and I think if we can, for economists to really dig deep and establish and consolidate the real productive value of that activity, just to elevate it and to make it clear this is how meaningful it is, I think is part of it. But if that can be elevated, then I would hope it would flow through to recognize the paid care equivalent, sort of similar types of roles like childcare and aged care. But this is also about liberating it from some of the gender norms that I think are also just a huge impediment to the dynamics within our paid workforce and our home life. So fathers and men not being being deterred, I guess, by these gender norms to spend that time with their family members, with their children, and to be deterred from entering the care profession. So I think partly it's more about dismantling these gender norms to allow for more mobility so that people can really move to where their well-being is enhanced. And in doing so, what we've seen from the past too is if we start to break down some of those gender patterns, that's where you see the industry and the occupation gain status and pay. We saw that with data IT, or what is now IT, so data computer scientist, traditionally used to be more female concentrated jobs until men came into that space, and it elevated in status and pay. So I think as long as there's a gender norm attached to it, that is still a big impediment to maintaining hierarchy. I don't know if I've answered your question in such a direct way, because I think perhaps what we're after is really something that can really, really cut through and be a more immediate way of correcting those financial gaps that are leading to women's, older women's poverty right now, and how to ensure that women's quality of life and entitlement at the end of their working life is a reflection of their contribution to the economy, rather than what was financially managed. Yeah, but maybe we can talk more about what ideas you might have as well.
There's a couple of comments in the chat, or a question from Rennie, asking about what are the mechanisms linking or underpinning workplace gender composition and inequality in wages. And then a second one, I'll just read it. I don't know who this person is, sorry. It's asking about the cost of living crisis. Is that more like a cost of working crisis? Even though we have the highest levels of female participation in the workforce, there's still a cost of working crisis. So more of a comment than a question.
Oh, that's a really important one. Yes. See if I can do both within the time frame. The mechanism. So this is partly speculation, Rennie, like as in why is it that female concentrated areas are so lower paid and male concentrated areas? I think so. If we think about gender norms and how what is inherent in gender norms is hierarchy. It's not an even playing field. It's a reflection of some sort of order and hierarchy. And also, I guess, the care services, economists tend to say that have arrived at a conclusion, mainstream economists have arrived at a conclusion that services, particularly care and community services, they're intangible. They're hard to quantify the value of these activities. You're providing care to a recipient, but it's an interaction. It's not like it's a car coming up a production line, which is a really solid concrete item that's standardized and you can measure and you can assign value to. So there's a school of thought that the intangibility, the transient sort of nature of care services makes it logistically difficult to measure. That's often one of the reasons. And that the benefits are not limited to just that moment of interaction. So the recipient of the care benefits, but also you are enabling the recipient of care, whether it's a young child, whether it's a primary school student, whether it's someone in older age care, you're enhancing their quality of life and their capacity to experience benefits and be self-sufficient future points in time as well, right? So it is difficult to measure. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but I think by asserting that argument, it steered economists towards the lower bound of saying it's difficult to measure, and so we won't go on the upper estimates of how valuable we think it is. We'll limit ourselves to how much are we paying for this service in the market, rather than really reading into these ripple effects throughout the economy, just how much this work really is valued. So I think that difficulty of measurement has actually been used as a way to kind of contribute to these mechanisms of not sort of investing in the effort to measure the value of care and early education, and that's associated with women as well. There would be more mechanisms at play here, but I think the work from sociology, with economic analysis, I think economists get to a point where they kind of run out of satisfactory explanations and have to turn to sociologists to say, I think you offer something more substantive here. These societal norms that we don't always have a strong grasp for and can't measure and can't neatly identify in some sort of, model, that are undeniably at play. Yeah.
We are pretty much out of time, Leonora, but did you want to say anything to Caroline North? Thanks for clarifying, Caroline. about the cost of working crisis.
Yes, absolutely. This is something I've thought of. So I think we're putting a lot of celebratory positive spin on women's increasing labour force participation. Like we've had record rates of participation rates, never been higher. Generally, that's associated as something positive. We know from the business cycle, the expansionary phase we're in means we're overshooting in the economy. We've got high inflationary pressure. So this is very much aligned with women entering the workforce out of necessity and therefore taking any job they can, not necessarily a high-paying job or a good quality job. These are women who are potentially more marginally engaged. They don't have a lot of bargaining power. They're taking up multiple job holdings. So yes, there's more to the eye than just looking at labour force participation. You have to look at the financial strain that's necessitating women stepping in to add that extra buffer to household income and just to pay the bills, to take up more hours of work, even if it's a low paid hourly rate, simply so that they can achieve the weekly income to pay the bills. It's what economists call the income effect. So yes, you picked up on something very important there.
I think we are out of time. I just wanted to add something to your response to Jenny. With the Hilda data, we can look at sort of intergenerational trends now to a certain extent in terms of how much time men and women spend on housework and unpaid care. And Rennie and Alice Campbell and I have done that in a recent paper. And what you see is that women's time on these unpaid activities does bounce around a bit over their life course, and from teenage years right through, but men stays pretty flat. So there is a bit of change and a bit of narrowing of the gap, but it's because in some cases women are doing a bit less. We're not seeing men taking on more of that work. Their time on unpaid care and housework is remarkably flat and stable at that kind of low level right across their life course. So yeah, it seems like women adjust their hours, but men don't, regardless of what's going on in their families or their work. So interesting to explain that. But yeah, look, it's a wonderful seminar. Thank you, Leonora. I can see lots of interesting overlaps with things that I've been thinking about. So I will follow up with you, particularly around the gender norms. And again, we're not seeing much change in those over time either. So there's work to be done. And I guess one question just that we can reflect on as we close is, how do we change what goes on within households? I think we've got policies that are directed at paid parental leave and workplace flexibility and so on, but coming up with policies that change how much men and women do in the home is much harder because it's seen as that private sphere, which government should not touch, even though they do in many ways. So that's the challenge, I think. But look, let me close off by just thanking you, Leonora, for a great presentation. Thanks everybody for coming. This is the last of our Life Course Centre seminars for the year. We will get them underway again next year, probably starting in February. Rennie Lee has done a wonderful job as our seminar coordinator, but if anyone is interested in taking over the seminar coordinator role and working with Carla and I to develop the seminar series for next year, I'm pretty sure that Rennie would continue to do it, but she's also indicated that she's happy to step aside if there's a very keen person in your group or if you're very keen to take it on. So please reach out to me or Rennie or Carla if you'd like to take on the coordinator role for next year. And just thanks everybody for coming today and throughout the year, and we'll look forward to another seminar series next year. And thanks again to Leonora for a really interesting topic. Thank you very much.